In a sense, content projection is like input properties, allowing you to pass information from a parent component to a child component. There are three differences, though, which make content projection appealing. The biggest is the fact that, unlike input properties, which pass a value to a variable and then the receiving component decides what to do with that value, content projection is strictly for display. Projected content is either displayed or not. That's pretty much it. Why is this appealing? Simply because it's focused. If you need to show content determined in one component in a location specified in another component, content projection is the easiest, fastest way to do that. Next, content projection can project nested components. We'll see an example of this in the demo in just a few moments. Last, content projection injects the entire DOM node specified in the source component into the child. This gives you the ability to still control the presentation styles and functionality of the projected content from the source component, instead of having to make the receiving component figure out how to style any content it receives and include any functionality inherent in that content. Angular has some built-in content projection that we can use declaratively. We'll use this to get an idea of what content projection is all about, and then look at it in code in a demo. To show this content projection, we have a snippet from our app component, from another component which is referenced inside app component, and finally a look at the HTML output after Angular does its magic. Starting in the HTML, you can see we have two delimiters, asterisks and hashes, which wrap everything we're looking at. Those obviously come from the first and last lines in app component. Nothing surprising here. The remaining content then comes from my component, but perhaps not in the way you would expect. We get the first line of content from inside my component showing up in the output. Then we get the content that was actually defined in app component, passing through the ng-content tag in my component and showing up in the output. And last, we get the final line of my component. It's pretty easy to see in this simple example, but the important thing to know is that any content defined inside a component's opening and closing tags will show up inside the body of that component's output wherever you have the ng-content tag. If you don't add the ng-content tag, content won't show up anywhere. If you include more than one ng-content tag inside my component, the last one listed will be used to display the content. Any previous ones are ignored, unless you make use of a capability called multi-slot or named content projection. Named content projection lets you define multiple pieces of content and then have multiple ng-content elements which are configured to display a specific piece of content. Each specific piece of content can be identified by an attribute, a CSS selector, or via a component's element tag. Let's go take a look at these plus normal or single slot projection in our demo. Loading up our content projection widget, I'll quickly go over what we have going on the screen here, and then we'll go back into Visual Studio Code and see how we got there. So we have a title of content projection, and that's styled larger font, it's black, and it's underscored. And then we have the text below that, the content is styled green. Now all of that is controlled by the parent component, except for we're doing a slight bit of trickery to get the title there, content projection, actually styled in the child. So we have the title being projected, we have the green content being projected, and then we have this other text down the bottom which is also being projected, but it's not into a specific named slot. So taking a look at Visual Studio Code, here is our widget component. This is where we're specifying all of that content. We have a content projection child element. All of this is content within that element. So we have some unnamed content. Then we have a div with a class of content. And this is where that stuff in the middle came from. We then have another block of unnamed content. It's just a paragraph. We have another block that has a noSelector attribute applied to it. But this, and this, and this are all considered unnamed. If we look back in the browser, they end up all down the bottom here. The content piece and the title specified down the bottom here are named. The title has a attribute of top, and the content, it has a class assigned to it of content. Looking at the CSS for our parent, you can see here's where we're specifying that our content is green. When we go over to the child in the HTML, you can see we have our NG content that's saying I want to display a piece of projected content. Specifically, I'm going to select the piece that has the top attribute on it. So that's this down here. So it's going to put that div in this location in place of the NG content. Now we're styling this in the child because I have it wrapped inside a div with a class of title. And that's what's specifying the styling for this. There is no styling in the parent component. If there were, it would override this. Next up, I have another NG content. Here I'm going for the content. So anything that has a class of content. So that's going to be this piece. You can see there's my title and there's my content. And then I have an HR, a horizontal rule, and then I have an unnamed NG content or untargeted NG content. So this is going to pick up anything that doesn't have an identifier back here. So that's this, and this, and this. And the unnamed pieces will be displayed in order. So that's these pieces down here. And the last thing I want to show you is that in the style sheet for the child, I am actually attempting, or I'm specifying, a different color for my content, but it's not applied because it's handled by the parent. We don't see blue text, we see green text. And then you can see here's where I'm specifying the information for styling the title. And that gets picked up because it's wrapped inside this, and inside the parent, I don't specify any styling for that content. So that is named and unnamed content projection. As I said, gives us the ability to, without code, take content from the parent and project it into the child and have the child control the location, but the parent still controls the presentation, the styling.